The badge reader at the mouth of Sublevel 9 had been throwing a soft amber error for 6 hours, and Dr. Aaron Vance had stopped looking at it. That was the thing about Vought black sites. Everything down here ran on the assumption that if it were truly broken, someone with more authority and less conscience would have already told you. So the light blinked, and the door held, and Vance kept his eyes on the containment ring at the center of the lab, where the most expensive mistake in the company's history was quietly humming toward its conclusion. They called it the aperture array. The internal memos called it Project Threshold. Vance and the other researchers, in the tired shorthand of people who worked 18-hour days for a corporation that would deny they existed if they died, just called it the door. 12 rings of superconducting alloy stacked into a tunnel of light, cold enough to frost the reinforced glass of the observation booth, feeding on a power draw that dimmed the lights across 4 sublevels every time they pushed the cycle past 60%. The official goal was resource acquisition. Somewhere in Vaught's endless appetite, someone had decided that if Compound V could be pulled out of a lab, then maybe anything could. That with enough money and enough men in white coats, you could reach into the seam between one place and another and simply take whatever you found on the other side. Tonight they were pushing past 60% for the first time. "Field's holding at 71, said Kessler from the console, her voice thin over the hum. Diane Kessler had been on Threshold longer than anyone, and she had the particular flatness of someone who no longer expected to be surprised by good news. 73. Aaron, we've never gone this. I know. He knew. The ring at the center of the tunnel had stopped being a ring. It had become a hole, not in the wall, not in the air, but in some more fundamental thing, a black absence rimmed in light, where the lab's fluorescence simply declined to reach. The cold coming off it was wrong. It didn't feel like temperature. It felt like a large room on the other side of a thin door, and something in that room that had noticed the door was open. Vance would remember, later, in the 11 minutes of life he had left, that the readings never spiked. There was no alarm, no cascade, none of the dramatic failure the safety briefings had drilled into them. The machine did exactly what they'd built it to do. That was the horror of it. The breach opened cleanly, held stable, and through it, unhurried, stepped a man. Except man was the wrong word, and every instinct in Vance's body registered that before his mind could argue. He was old in a way that had nothing to do with the lines of his face. He wore robes, layered, ceremonial, the deep color of something between blood and ink, hung with ornament that caught the fluorescence and gave them back wrong. His head was shaved smooth, and a horn, an actual horn, pale and curved, swept back from his brow like a piece of him had decided the human silhouette was optional. He was enormous. Not Homelander enormous, not built for cameras enormous. He filled the space the way weather fills a valley. And when he turned his head and took in the lab, the frost, the rings, the small, warm bodies of the people who had opened his door, he did it with the mild, faintly bored attention of a man inspecting a building he has already decided to buy. Containment, Vance heard himself say. Kessler, drop the younger tech, Petrov, was closer. He had a sidearm, because everyone at a black site had a sidearm, and he did the thing they'd trained him to do, which was raise it and shout a warning. Vance never heard the words. There was a sound like the whole room inhaling, a compression in the air that pressed on his eardrums, and Petrov was simply not there. Was a red suggestion across the far wall, and a spatter on the frosted glass, and a wet sound that arrived a half-second after the rest of it, the body's argument with physics resolving late. The old man had not appeared to move. His hand was raised, 2 fingers extended, as if he had flicked a fly off a table. Kessler was screaming. Someone hit the alarm at last, and the amber error light was joined by red, and the whole sublevel began to howl. It didn't matter. Vance understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that the alarm was not for them. The alarm was a message being sent to people upstairs, people in glass towers, who would spend the next several hours learning what Vance already knew, that they had built a door, and something on the other side had been patient enough to wait for it, and now it was here, and it was looking at the room the way a landlord looks at a property with tenants who don't yet know they're being evicted. The thing that had been a man looked at Aaron Vance. It seemed, for a moment, almost curious. You reach for things you do not understand, it said. The voice was deep, unhurried, and it carried in a room full of shrieking alarms as if the alarms were being polite. That is not unusual. Every world I have known has men like you. It tilted its horned head. Tell me, who owns you? Vance didn't answer. He was already running for the sealed door, for the amber light that had been broken for 6 hours. And that failure, that one deferred repair, that one thing nobody with authority had bothered to fix, was the reason his badge worked when Kessler's didn't, the reason he made it into the corridor and she did not. He would carry that for the rest of his life. It would not be long. 14 floors up and half a city over. The news reached the only place in the world that mattered. Vought Tower at night was a monument to the idea that light could be a kind of lie. Every window blazed, not because anyone was working, but because a dark tower photographs like a dead company, and Vought did not do dead. The glass and chrome went up and up into a sky the color of a bruise, and at the top, in offices designed to make visitors feel the specific smallness the building was engineered to produce, the machine that ran the world's superheroes began, quietly, to panic. Ashley Barrett got the call at 11:40 p.m., and by 11:52 she had reduced 2 junior staffers to tears, torn a fistful of her own hair loose in the elevator, a habit she'd developed and hidden and could no longer hide, and assembled the beginnings of the only response Vought ever really had to anything, a story. Because that was the secret under the secret, the thing beneath even Compound V. Vought did not sell heroes. It did not even sell soups. It sold a version of events, and the version was always the same. Whatever happened, we meant it to happen, and it is good, and you are safe. That machine had survived exposed lies, dead civilians, a soup melting a man on live television. It would survive a hole in a basement. It had to. Because the alternative, that something had come into the building that Vought could not brand, could not bury, and could not spin, was not a thought the machine was built to have. And this, the narrator might tell you, before we go any further, this whole savage story of the day a corporation met something older and hungrier than itself, is exactly the kind of collision this channel lives for. If you want more of them, subscribe, and drop the next one in the comments. Name a universe, and name a character. Any world you want thrown into the meat grinder, and it might be the next video. This one was suggested by Sean Williams, and written, as always, by me. Now, back to the tower, where Ashley Barrett is about to make a phone call she will regret. The problem, Ashley knew, was that there was exactly one person in the building with the authority to contain a physical threat, and he was the last person on Earth you wanted to hand a problem you couldn't control. Because in this version of the world, this late, rotten hour of it, Homelander did not answer to Vought anymore, not really. Stan Edgar was gone from the top floor, sidelined into something between advisor and prisoner, his cold competence a museum piece in a company that had traded away its brakes. The Seven were a fractured brand held together by press releases. Half its chairs were empty or filled by whoever tested well. Vought was still the shape of a corporation, still ran on money and PR and the machinery of law, but the thing at the center of it was no longer a boardroom. It was a man who could kill everyone in that boardroom in the time it took them to stand, who knew it, and who had recently, publicly, gleefully, begun to stop pretending otherwise. The country had watched Homelander laser a protester on camera and cheer, and it had cheered back, and that was the world now. Authoritarian gloss over a god with a child's wounds. Vought didn't manage him, it served him and prayed. So when Ashley made the call, she made it because there was no one else, and because a small, corporate, self-preserving part of her hoped that whatever was in sublevel 9, and whatever was on the top floor, might solve each other and leave her out of it. "There's a situation in R&D, she said, when the line connected. Her voice did the thing she'd trained it to do, the flat professionalism that had kept her alive this long. A containment event. We don't know what it is. It's not one of ours. It's not a soup. It killed the Threshold team." A pause. When Homelander spoke, he sounded delighted, which was always the worst way for him to sound. Not a soup. A soft laugh. "Ashley, you know how boring my week's been. Somebody finally break into my house?" "Sir, we don't have a read on its capabilities. You'd recommend." He said it the way a cat says a mouse's name. "Here's what you'll do. You'll keep everyone else out of my way. And I'll go downstairs and remind whatever crawled out of your little science project whose city this is." The line went dead before she could answer, and Ashley Barrett stood in her too bright office at the top of the world and understood, distantly, that she had just introduced the two most dangerous things she had ever encountered, and asked them to sort out the introductions themselves. In Sublevel 9, Saturn had not moved from the containment ring. He did not need to. In the minutes since the door had closed behind him, and it had closed, he had felt the machine's field collapse, felt the seam between worlds seal at his back, and had noted this with the mild interest of a traveler observing that his ship has left without him and deciding it does not matter. He had learned a great deal simply by standing still and letting the room tell him about itself. He had ruled for 800 years, not a kingdom, not a nation, a world, a government spanning every sea, its true machinery hidden beneath a comforting fiction of kings and councils, its power resting not on the strength of its soldiers, but on the perfect, absolute control of what people were permitted to believe. Saint Jaygarcia Saturn had spent 8 centuries learning that the sword was the crudest instrument of power and the least important. The men who won were the men who owned the story. Everything else was cleanup. So he read the room. He read the sterile, expensive cowardice of the architecture, a building that spent money to look busy. He read the corpse of the young man he'd swatted aside, and the standard-issue sidearm, and the fact that these people had reached across the void with a machine, but sent a boy with a pistol to greet what came back. A civilization, then, that trusted its tools far more than its warriors. He read the frantic language of the alarms and, when a screen on the far wall flickered to a muted broadcast, some manufactured hero in a garish suit smiling over a chyron of adoring text, he read the most important thing of all. They worshiped them. These people had built gods and put them on screens, and sold the worship back to themselves. It was a cruder, gaudier, infinitely more profitable version of the exact machine Saturn had spent his long life tending. Where his world hid its power behind a curtain of dignity, this one dressed it in spectacle and charged admission. It was vulgar. It was obscene. It was, he thought, standing in the frost and the wailing light with the blood of a stranger cooling on the wall, extraordinarily well suited to a man who already knew exactly how such a machine worked, and who had never in 800 years been anything but the hand that owned it. Above him, the elevators were moving. He could feel the weight of what was descending toward him, something powerful, something that thought its power made it the top of this small world's order. Saturn had met 1,000 such creatures. He had outlived every one. The warrior god of the world government turned to face the elevator doors, folded his hands and, for the first time since he'd stepped through the door into this loud, bright, worshipful little world, allowed himself the smallest, coldest suggestion of a smile. He did not wonder whether he would take this place. He only wondered how long it would take, and how few of them would have to understand it was happening. The elevator to Sublevel 9 took 11 seconds. Homelander spent them smiling. He liked descending. He liked the way the numbers counted down and the pressure changed, and the little people in the little floors got further and further above him, out of his way, out of his story. Whatever was down here had killed a research team. Good. That meant it would be interesting, and Homelander had been so profoundly, murderously bored. Boredom was the thing nobody warned you about when you were the most powerful being on the planet. You ran out of people worth frightening. You started inventing reasons. The doors opened on frost and blood and red light, and Homelander stepped out into the ruin of the lab, already composing the line he'd deliver. Something cutting, something for the private audience he always imagined watching him. And the being at the center of the room turned its horned head, looked at him, and did nothing. That was the first wrong note. He was used to a specific sequence: recognition, then fear. Sometimes the fear tried to dress itself up as defiance, and that was his favorite, because he got to watch it come apart. But there was always the flicker, the animal moment when a person's body understood what he was before their pride could catch up. He had seen it in senators and soldiers and other Soops, in Butcher, in Stan Edgar's cold, dead eyes on the rare occasions he could provoke it. It was the closest thing Homelander had to being loved. The thing in the robes did not flicker. It looked at him the way Homelander looked at a crowd. You are the one they built the story around, it said. Its voice filled the room without effort. I have been watching your image on their screens. You wear your power on the outside, loudly. A pause, weighted with something that took Homelander a beat too long to identify as disappointment. It is a young way to hold power. Effective, for a time. I don't know what you are. Homelander kept his voice light, amused, the on-camera warmth he could summon over anything. Underneath it, a cold thread he hadn't felt in years was working its way up his spine. But you came into my house and made a mess, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me what you are and where you came from, and then, depending on how I'm feeling, his eyes flared, the twin points of red kindling. I'm going to decide whether you're useful or just fun. Yes, said Saturn, show me. Homelander laced him. It was not a warning shot. Homelander did not do warning shots anymore. That was an old, apologetic version of himself he'd left behind. Twin beams of concentrated heat, hot enough to slag steel, hot enough to open the men he despised from throat to groin, crossed the ruined lab in the time it takes to blink, and struck the being in the robes full in the chest. And stopped. Not deflected, not endured with a grimace. Stopped, as if the heat had reached the surface of the thing and simply been declined, absorbed into 800 years of a durability that had shrugged off blades meant for gods. The robes did not catch. The frost on the floor around Saturn's feet did not melt. He stood in the full fury of the most destructive Soop the world had ever produced, and looked, if anything, mildly patient, the way a professor looks at a student running out the clock on a wrong answer. Homelander cut the beams. In the sudden dark of their absence, the two of them regarded each other across the wreckage, and something happened in Homelander's chest that had not happened since he was a child, strapped to a table. Something he had spent his whole life building a world specifically to never feel again. He was not, he realized, the most dangerous thing in the room. There, Saturn said softly, almost kindly. Now you understand something you did not understand a moment ago. That is a valuable feeling. Most men your age never learn it. He folded his hands. I am not going to fight you. Fighting is what men do when they have failed at everything else. I came to this world 4 minutes ago, and I have already learned that it worships creatures like you and pays money for the privilege. That interests me far more than your temper. And that, more than the heat that hadn't worked, more than the absence of fear, was the thing that broke the moment open. Because Homelander understood threats. He understood monsters. What he could not process, what he had no defense against, was dismissal. This thing had looked at the sun of his rage and found it a small, familiar, boring light. Homelander did what he always did when the world stopped agreeing with his image of it. He smiled wider, and he lied. You know what? He spread his hands, magnanimous, a king pardoning a jester. I like you. I do. You've got, he searched for it, and hated that he had to, presence. And I don't kill everything interesting the second I meet it, whatever they tell you. He backed toward the elevator, and the retreat cost him something he would spend weeks pretending it hadn't. Vought'll want to talk to you. Boring people, but they'll feed you, put you up, run their little tests. Enjoy the hospitality. The doors opened behind him. We'll finish our conversation later. We will, Saturn agreed, and it did not sound like a threat, which was worse. The doors closed. The elevator began, at last, to rise. And in the 11 seconds it took, Homelander stood alone in the mirrored box, staring at his own reflected face. The perfect jaw, the flag on his shoulders, the eyes that had made a nation kneel. And for the first time in longer than he could stand to remember, he could not tell whether the thing looking back at him was a god or a frightened boy in a costume. By dawn, Vought had done what Vought did. It had built a box around the problem, a literal one, a reinforced sub-level suite retrofitted overnight by a contractor crew who signed NDAs thick as Bibles and would be told, if they asked, that they'd been renovating a storage facility. And it had built the more important box, the one Vought was actually good at, a category, because an uncategorized thing was a thing that could not be managed, and Vought managed everything. So a committee assembled in a war room on the 41st floor, and over cold coffee and colder fear, a dozen of the most powerful executives in American media set about deciding what Saint Saturn was. He's an asset, said Ted Kobluk from Acquisitions, who had never met a horror he couldn't put on a balance sheet. Whatever he is, he stopped Homelander's heat vision cold. Do you understand what the defense contracts alone? He's a liability, said the woman from legal, whose name was Karen Voss, and who had not slept. He killed 4 employees. Uninsurable. If this leaks, nothing leaks, said Ashley from the head of the table, and the flatness in her voice shut the room up. She had spent the night learning that Homelander had gone down to a fight and come back up quiet, and quiet Homelander was a data point that terrified her more than a rampage would have. We control the story or the story controls us, same as always. So somebody in this room is going to tell me what the story is. What none of them understood, what not one executive in that overlit room could have grasped, was that they were not studying Saturn. Saturn was studying them. He had allowed the box. Of course he had allowed it. A cell that its occupant permits is not a cell. It is an observation post. And Saturn had spent 800 years learning that the fastest way to understand a machine is to let it try to process you and watch which gears turn. So he sat in the suite they'd built, in a chair that strained under him, and he let their scientists come with their scanners, and their handlers come with their questions, and their cameras run around the clock. And from every one of them, he took information, the way a spider takes the vibrations of its own web and reads the whole garden from a single strand. The scientist they sent most often was a nervous, decent man named David Reyes, who had drawn the assignment because he was junior enough to be expendable and stable enough not to run. Reyes was supposed to be assessing Saturn. Instead, over 3 days of measurements that returned data his instruments refused to believe, he found himself answering questions. This Vought, Saturn said, on the second day, watching Reyes fumble with a sensor that kept overloading. It is not a government, but it acts as one. It owns the Soops, you call them. It owns the men who watch the Soops. It owns, if I understand your screens, the men who are meant to govern this country. He said it without inflection, a man confirming a map, and the source of their strength, this compound. It is injected, manufactured, hidden. Reyes went very still. That last part was not public. That last part was the deepest secret Vought held, that no Soop was born, that the gods were made, in labs, from a chemical, often forced into infants who never chose it. It was the lie under the whole world, and this thing in the chair had assembled it from 3 days of overhearing frightened technicians and reading the fear on their faces when certain topics came near. How? Reyes started. Because it is always the same, Saturn said, and for the first time something like warmth entered his voice. Not kindness, but the deep satisfaction of a craftsman recognizing his own trade practiced by amateurs. Every world builds its power on a secret, and every secret is a hostage. The people believe a story. The story rests on a lie, and whoever holds the lie holds the people. He looked at David Reyes with those ancient, patient eyes, and Reyes felt himself become very small and very seen. Your masters believe they hold this world because they hold the lie. They are correct. What they have not understood, what they are not capable of understanding, because they are new and loud and frightened, is that a lie can be taken, quietly, from the inside, by someone who has done it before. Reyes did not report the conversation. He told himself it was because it would sound insane. The truer reason, the one he wouldn't examine for a long time, was that some animal part of him had already begun, without permission, to listen. That was the thing the war room on the 41st floor never put in a slide. That was the classification they could not make. They were arguing over whether Saturn was an asset or a liability, a weapon or a lawsuit, and the correct answer, the only answer, was that he was a rival, the one thing Vought had never once faced in its entire history. Not a stronger fist, but a better mind, running the exact same con, and hungry. By the third night, Saturn had the shape of it. He understood the fracture at the top of the company, the unstable god who ruled by fear, and the cold old man Edgar, who had ruled by control and been pushed aside. He understood that the machine still ran, but that no one was truly steering it anymore, that Vought was a body with a severed head still pretending to walk, and he understood. with the clean certainty of a man reading a language he'd spoken for centuries, that a body without a head does not need to be conquered. It only needs to be offered one. He sat in the chair they'd built to hold him, in the box they thought was a cell, in the tower they believed was theirs, and Saint Jaygarcia Saturn, warrior god, elder of a world government, patient hand of 8 centuries of hidden rule, began, very quietly, to decide which of them he would use to open the door. Homelander did not sleep, but he had a ritual that approximated it. He would go up, past the top floor, past the helipad, out through the cold air until the city was a circuit board of light below him, and there was nothing above but the indifferent dark. Up there, alone, he could be the thing he told himself he was. No cameras, no handlers. No Ashley's tics or Edgar's dead-eyed disapproval or the wet, needy love of a crowd that would turn on him the instant the story turned. Just Homelander and the sky. And the sky, at least, had the good manners to be beneath him. For 3 nights after Sublevel 9, the sky didn't help. He kept replaying it. That was the thing he couldn't stand. That his mind, which he could aim like his eyes, kept returning to the moment without his permission. The heat leaving him. The heat arriving, and then nothing, the robes not catching, the frost not melting, the old thing standing in the full output of everything Homelander was, and finding it boring. He had killed men with a fraction of that. He had opened Soldier Boy's chest. No, that wasn't right, but he'd wanted to. He'd imagined it 1,000 times. He had ended 100 arguments with that light, and this creature had watched it come and declined it the way you decline a canapé. You wear your power on the outside, loudly. It is a young way to hold power. Homelander hung in the black air over the tower, and hated, with an intensity that surprised him, how much the words had lodged. Because the worst insults were the ones that named a thing you already secretly feared. He had always known, in the place he never went, the place with the table and the straps and the men in coats who'd measured his tolerance for pain against a clipboard, that his power was the only thing. That underneath it, there was a boy who had never been held, never been chosen, never once been loved by anyone who wasn't afraid or paid. Strip the heat and the flight and the invulnerability away, and what was left? A wound with a cape on it. He knew that. He had built the entire world into a shape that would never make him look at it. And this thing had looked at him for 4 minutes and seen it. A young way to hold power. As if there were an old way. As if the horned monster in the basement had something Homelander didn't. Something that wasn't strength, because it plainly had strength too. But something underneath the strength. Some deep stone floor of certainty that Homelander had never once stood on in his life. He wanted to go back down and kill it. He could. He was almost sure he could. Enough heat, enough speed, tear the robes off and find the soft thing inside. Everything had a soft thing inside. Everything he'd ever met. But almost sure was a phrase Homelander had not had to think in a very long time, and the not being sure was its own small nightmare, and beneath even that was the real reason he didn't go down and try. He was afraid that if he did, it would look at him again with that patient, disappointed calm, and that it would be right again. So instead, on the 4th night, he did something worse. He went down to talk. He told himself it was strategy. Vought wanted the thing studied. Fine. He'd study it. He told himself it was surveillance. You kept your enemies close. You learned their weaknesses. He told himself a dozen things in the elevator down, and not one of them was the truth, which was that he could not stay away. He had spent his whole life being the only one of his kind, the singular apex, alone at the top of a world too small for him. And downstairs there was, for the first time, someone else up there, someone who might understand. The loneliest being on the planet had found the one thing his loneliness had never accounted for, a peer, and he came back down the way a moth comes back, hating the light and unable to name why he kept turning toward it. Saturn was where they'd left him, in the reinforced suite, seated. He did not rise when Homelander entered. He never rose for anyone. Homelander noticed that his own body wanted to be annoyed by it, and that a deeper part of him was, obscenely, relieved. Relieved to be in a room where he didn't have to perform the little theater of dominance, because it plainly wouldn't work, and so there was no point, and the absence of the performance felt, God help him, like rest. "You came back," Saturn observed. "I go where I want." Homelander dropped into the chair across from him with a studied carelessness. "This is my building." "Is it?" Not really a question. Saturn regarded him with those ancient eyes, and Homelander had the disorienting sense of being read the way he read other people. All his little tells laid bare. The too casual posture, the eyes that kept not quite meeting. "You do not sleep," Saturn said. "You circle this tower in the dark. I have felt you pass overhead these 3 nights." A pause. "You are the most powerful creature in this world, and you spend your nights alone in the cold above a building full of people who fear you. Why?" "Because it's quiet," Homelander said, too fast. "Because down here, everyone lies to you," Saturn corrected, without heat. "And you have grown so used to the lying that you can no longer taste anything else. They tell you that you are loved. They tell you that you are a hero. They tell you that you are strong, and you are. But strength is the one true thing in a mouthful of false ones, so you have built your whole self on it, because it is the only word they say to you that you can believe." He let that sit. "I do not lie to you. That is why you came back. You have never in your life sat in a room with someone who was not afraid of you and not using you, and some part of you has been starving for that room without knowing the room could exist." Homelander's jaw worked. The red kindled in his eyes. Reflex, the body reaching for the one argument that always won, and then, slowly, guttered out, because they'd already established that it didn't win here, and there was something almost unbearably relieving about being somewhere it didn't have to. "You don't know me," he said, and heard how much it sounded like a child. "I have known 10,000 of you," Saturn said. "Every world produces one, the strong, wounded child who is handed a kingdom, and spends his life terrified that someone will notice he does not know how to hold it." He leaned forward, and the chair complained under him, and his voice dropped into something almost gentle, which was the most dangerous register he had. "I am not going to tell you that you are weak. You are not weak. You could kill everyone in this tower, and one day, when the loneliness gets bad enough, you will. But strength is not power, child. That is the thing no one has ever told you, because the only people who could tell you are the ones you have killed for saying true things. Strength is a tool of power, and you have been handed the crudest tool of all, and told it is the whole trade." "Then what's power?" Homelander said. He hated that he asked. He asked anyway. "Power," Saturn said, "is when they do what you want and believe it was their idea. Power is when the story tells itself. You force the world, and forcing is exhausting, and it must be done again every morning. And the moment you tire the world, springs back into its old shape and hates you. I have ruled for 800 years, and I have raised my hand perhaps a dozen times. The rest was arranged. The rest they did to themselves, gratefully, while thanking me for the privilege." He spread his hands, taking in the tower above them, the whole rotten, glittering machine of it. "You have all the strength in this world and none of the power. Your Vought has all the power and none of the strength. It has always been thus, in every world, the fist and the hand that owns the fist, and they are never the same creature, and they spend their lives at each other's throats, because neither can admit it needs the other." He smiled, faintly, terribly, "unless someone comes along who is both." And there it was. Homelander felt the shape of the offer before Saturn spoke another word, felt it settle over the room like the cold that had come off the breach, and the horror of it was not that he found it repellent. The horror was that some deep, starving, unloved part of him found it warm. Elsewhere in the tower, Stan Edgar was reading. He had been reduced, that was the word the org chart used, though no one said it to his face, to an advisory role, an office 3 floors down from where the decisions were made, a phone that rang less each month. He had watched a company he'd built into the most powerful institution on the continent hand its own throat to a man-child with laser eyes, because the man-child tested well, and Edgar's caution did not. And he had done what he always did, which was to wait, and watch, and file away the things other people were too frightened to look at directly. The Sub-Level 9 reports had crossed his desk because they weren't supposed to. A junior analyst who still owed Edgar loyalties from the old days had flagged them and let them slip. Edgar read them twice. Then he set them down, removed his glasses, and sat for a long moment in the particular stillness of a man who has spent his life recognizing threats and has just recognized a new one that frightens him in a way Homelander never had. Because Homelander, for all his power, was legible. Edgar had spent years managing him precisely because a wound was predictable. You fed it, you flattered it, you steered it. Homelander wanted to be loved and would burn the world for the feeling, and a man who understood that could, for a while, hold the leash. Edgar looked at the reports, at the 4 dead scientists, at the heat vision that had done nothing, at the transcripts of a creature who had assembled Vought's deepest secret from 3 days of ambient fear. This was not a wound you could feed. This was something that had been sitting where Edgar sat, running the machine Edgar ran, for 800 years, and had walked into Vought and recognized the whole apparatus at a glance the way a locksmith recognizes a lock. Edgar had built his life on being the smartest, coldest, most patient man in any room, and he understood, reading those reports in his diminished little office, that a room had just opened somewhere below him, that he was no longer the coldest thing in. He picked up his phone. He estimated, a very short window, in which the fact that he'd been sidelined might, for once, be an advantage, a threat overlooked, a piece off the board, a man everyone had stopped watching. There were only a handful of forces in this world that Vought had never managed to fully control, that operated in exactly the blind spots a quiet, discarded man could still reach. He knew what one of them was called. He'd spent years trying to destroy it. Now, for the first time, Stan Edgar found himself wondering whether Billy Butcher might be persuaded to take a meeting. The boys found out because Frenchie couldn't stop poking the internet with a stick. It wasn't intelligence in any clean sense. It was pattern. The thing Frenchie was better at than any spook Grace Mallory had ever run. The ability to feel a wrongness in the noise, the way a spider feels a wrong tug on the web. A Vought contractor crew pulled off 3 other jobs and rerouted to the tower on no notice. Paid cash, NDAs the length of a phone book, a spike in the tower's power draw big enough to brown out 2 grids, and get quietly blamed on a substation fault that the substation company hadn't reported. 4 names in Vought's R&D division that stopped badging in and whose social media went abruptly, professionally silent, not deleted, maintained, the way you maintain the accounts of the dead when you don't want anyone asking where the bodies went. Somebody died in that building, Frenchie said, sprawled across the couch in the safe house with 3 laptops open and a cigarette he wasn't supposed to be smoking indoors. 4 somebodies. And Vought spent a great deal of money making sure it looks like nothing happened, which is of course how you can tell. People die in that building every week, said MM, from the kitchen, where he was making the coffee, because if he didn't, no one would, and they'd all drink Frenchies, which was a war crime. Mother's Milk had the tired patience of a man holding a family together with one hand and this crew together with the other. That's Tuesday. What makes this one worth my ulcer? Because, Frenchie said, and turned one of the laptops around, of him. The screen showed grainy footage, a fragment, pulled from a maintenance camera that Vought had scrubbed from every official system and missed on exactly 1 third-party backup, because you could delete a thing 1,000 times and it only had to survive once. 11 frames, a ruined lab, and a figure in dark robes, horned, enormous, standing in a ring of frost while a red suggestion that had recently been a person cooled on the wall behind him. Huey leaned in. What am I looking at? I have no idea, Frenchie said, with the delight of a man for whom no idea was the best possible state. And neither does Vought, which is the part that should frighten you. Look at the timestamps on the contractor jobs. They did not classify this thing and move on. They are still, 3 days later, throwing money and secrecy at it. Vought does not spend like this on a problem it understands. This, he tapped the screen, is Vought frightened. And Vought is never frightened, because Vought is the thing that frightens. That was when Butcher spoke, from the doorway, where he'd been standing long enough to hear all of it. Then we want it, Billy Butcher said. He came into the room the way he came into every room, like he owned it and was disappointed in the furniture. There was a coldness in him lately that even the crew had started to clock. A butcher who'd been chasing Homelander so long that the chase had begun to hollow him out, who measured everything now against a single question: does this hurt them? He looked at the 11 frames, at the horned thing that had made Vought spend contractor money it didn't want a paper trail on, and something moved behind his eyes that Huey had learned to be afraid of. Think about it, Butcher said. Some big spooky bastard falls out of a hole in the basement, and does what none of us has managed in years. Walks into their house and puts the fear of God into them. Kills their people. Makes them quiet. He said the word the way another man would say bleeding. Homelander went down there. Frenchie. When'd he stop his little night flights? Frenchie checked. Blinked. The same night. He's grounded 3 nights running. First time in months. There it is. Butcher's smile had no warmth in it at all. Something scared Homelander. Whatever's in that basement, it's the biggest lever anybody's ever had against Vought, and it's just sitting there, and we're gonna be the ones who grab it. Or, said Hughie. The room turned to him. Hughie Campbell had learned, over the years and the bodies, to hate the moment when he had to be the one who said the obvious frightening thing that Butcher's tunnel vision drove straight past. He hated it, because he was almost always right, and it almost never mattered. Or, Hughie said, it's a thing that killed 4 people by looking at them, that a Soup's heat vision didn't work on, that has Vought, who owns senators and covers up massacres before lunch, genuinely terrified, and we're the crew of guys with a van and some temporary V and no plan, and the move you're pitching is to walk toward it. He spread his hands. What if it's not a lever, Butcher? What if it's just worse? What if the thing that scares Vought because it's the one thing out there that would be worse to have in charge than Vought is? For a moment, nobody said anything. Kimiko, curled in the armchair by the window, watched the exchange with the still attention she brought to everything, and then signed something quick and sharp with her hands. Who read her best, translated flatly. She says a monster that frightens monsters is not a friend. It's a bigger monster. She's not wrong, said, on his own account, setting the coffee down. Hughie's not wrong. Every time we find a shortcut to hurting these people, it costs us more than the hurt was worth. Every time. He looked at Butcher. We got scars from every lever we ever pulled. When do we learn? But Butcher had already decided. Hughie could see it. The way the objections just sluiced off him. Water off a coat. Because the man had reduced his whole life to a single equation, and this thing plugged into the side of it that said hurt them. We're not marrying it, Butcher said. We're just gonna go have a look. Introduce ourselves. See what a bloke who scares Homelander wants out of life. And if it turns out he's worse, the smile again, then he's just Vought's problem in it, and we're back where we started. No harm done. No harm done, Hughie repeated, hollow. That phrase had preceded roughly every catastrophe of his adult life. The meeting Butcher didn't yet know he'd be taking came to him. They'd relocated. Butcher never let the crew sit on one safe house longer than the itch in his neck allowed, and the new place was a dead auto shop on the industrial edge of the city. All rolled steel doors, and the ghost smell of motor oil. It was there, 2 nights after the 11 frames, that a car Butcher didn't recognize pulled up outside a location that no one was supposed to know. And a driver Butcher did recognize. One of the quiet, expensive kind. The kind that came with the quiet, expensive kind of man. Got out and opened a rear door. Butcher had a gun up before the passenger's shoes touched the ground. Mr. Butcher, said Stan Edgar, unbothered by the barrel, straightening his cuffs. You can shoot me, and I'd understand the impulse, given our history. Or you can spend 10 minutes learning why the most dangerous thing you have ever heard of just moved into a building you've spent your life trying to burn down. I'll leave the choice to you. I only ask that you make it before I catch cold. Butcher did not lower the gun. But he didn't fire either, and in the world these 2 men lived in, that counted as an invitation. They talked in the gutted office of the auto shop, under a single working bulb, 2 men who had spent years as each other's most respected enemies. Edgar did not waste words. He never had. He laid it out, the breach, the being, the 4 dead, the heat vision that had done nothing, the transcripts of a creature that had assembled Vought's oldest secret from ambient fear. And then he said the thing he'd come to say, the thing that had brought the coldest man in the world to beg a favor from the man who hated him most. I have spent my career, Edgar said, managing the most powerful being on the planet. I could do it, because Homelander is a wound, and wounds are predictable. You feed them. This, he set a folder on the desk, is not a wound. This is a professional. It has done, somewhere, for a very long time, exactly what I do. And it does it better, and it has recognized my company as a machine it already knows how to drive. Homelander wants to be loved. That thing wants to own, and it has looked at Vought and seen, correctly, that Vought is a body with no head, a machine running on momentum with a frightened child sitting where the pilot should be. He met Butcher's eyes. I did not come here because I've had a change of heart. I have no heart. You've said so yourself, and you were right. I came here because you and I want the same thing for once. You want Vought weak. I want it mine. Or failing that, standing. And neither of us gets what we want if that creature in the basement finishes what it has already started. Butcher listened to all of it with the flat, hooded attention of a man being handed a knife by someone he'd very much like to stab. When Edgar finished, Butcher was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed. Short, ugly, genuinely amused. So let me get this straight, Butcher said. Big scary bogeyman falls out the sky and starts nicking your company off you. And you, Stan Edgar, cold as a witch's tit, never asked me for fup, all in your life, 'cept to die quietly. You come crawling out here in the dark to ask me for help. He leaned back. That's the funniest thing I've heard all year. You know that? That's not a threat report, Stan. That's the best news I've had since. His face closed, briefly, on Becca's name, on all the names, in a long while. Because whatever's got you this scared, it's doing my job for me. So why in God's name would I lift a finger to stop it? Because, Edgar said, and for the first time in the years Butcher had known him, the man's voice carried something that was almost like fear. You have spent your life hating a devil you understood, and you are about to learn what it is to want the old devil back. The bulb hummed. Somewhere out in the dark, the city that worshipped its heroes slept on, dreaming of the bright manufactured gods on its screens, none of them dreaming of the ox-headed thing in the basement of the tower that was, quietly, already deciding who it would wear as a face. And Billy Butcher, for the first time in a long time, did not have a clever answer ready. Saturn asked to see the boardroom. He asked the way he did everything, as though the granting were a formality already completed, a courtesy he extended to let others feel they'd chosen it. 3 days into the hospitality, with Reyes's instruments still returning numbers no one believed, and Homelander coming down each night to sit in the room where no one lied to him, Saturn told his handlers, mildly, that he would like to address the people who ran the company, not the scientists, the owners. And Vought, which had spent a week failing to build a category that could hold him, discovered that it had somehow already begun doing what he asked, before anyone with authority agreed to it. That was the thing about Saturn. By the time you understood you were obeying, the obedience was old. So they brought him up. It should have reassured them, having him in the light. The 41st floor war room was Vought at its most Vought. Glass and chrome and a table that had cost more than most of the people cleaning it would earn in a lifetime. A view of the city arranged so that whoever sat at the head felt they were looking down on the world, because they were. Ashley sat at that head, or tried to. The seat felt suddenly ceremonial with the horned thing standing at the far end. Kobluk was there, and Voss from legal, and 8 others whose job was to own things, and who had never in their lives been in a room where their ownership felt provisional. Homelander leaned against the window, arms crossed, watching. He'd insisted on being there. Ashley hadn't been able to tell whether that was reassuring or the single most dangerous variable in the room, and she'd settled, as she settled most things now, on being quietly terrified of both possibilities at once. You've had a week to decide what I am, Saturn said, without preamble. He did not sit. The chair they'd set out for him stayed empty, and its emptiness became, somehow, the most powerful object in the room. You have decided nothing, because you cannot. So allow me to save you the trouble. I am not an asset. I am not a threat. I am a demonstration. He let his gaze travel the table, unhurried, cataloging each face. And what I am here to demonstrate is that everything you believe about your own power is a child's misunderstanding of the word. Kobluk, who had built a career on never being the most frightened person in a room, made the mistake of trying to steer. With respect, whatever you are, you're a guest in a building owned by the most powerful media corporation on. Ted Kobluk, Saturn said. The room went cold, because no one had told him the names, no one had introduced the table, and he said it not as a threat, but as punctuation, the way you'd set down a coin to show you had a purse full. You have a daughter at a school in Connecticut whose tuition your assistant pays from an account your wife does not know about. Saturn continued, evenly. Because the account also pays for an apartment in the city that your wife does not know about either. I learned this in 4 days, from a building that believes it is watching me. I did not use a Soop. I did not use a machine. I used the thing your entire civilization has forgotten how to fear. I paid attention. He turned from Kobluk, who had gone the gray of old paper, and addressed the table as a whole. Every one of you is here. Every one of you has a coin like his. I know where they all are. I have known for 2 days, and I have done nothing with them, because doing something would be forcing, and forcing is what the weak do when they have run out of better options. I am not going to blackmail you. I am going to explain something to you, and you are going to understand it, and then you are going to want, of your own free will, to give me what I am about to describe. And what's that? Ashley managed. The company, Saturn said, simply, as if asking for the salt. The word landed, and the room did not know what to do with it. Voss actually laughed, a sharp, involuntary bark of the wrong emotion. You can't just. Vought is a publicly traded. I am not asking to be named on a document, Saturn said, with the patience of an adult correcting a bright child. Documents are the story you tell yourselves. I am telling you how the real machine will run from now on. You will keep your titles. You will keep your offices and your salaries and your coin accounts and your apartments in the city. The story on the surface will not change at all. That is the entire point. A story that changes is a story that draws attention, and I do not want attention. I want the thing under the story. You will simply find that the decisions you make happen to be the decisions I would make. You will find that you want, quite sincerely, what I want. And you will thank me for it, because I am going to give you something none of you has ever had. He paused. You are going to feel safe, not the counterfeit safety of your PR. Real safety, the safety of belonging to something that cannot be broken, because it has never, in 800 years, been broken. We already have, Ashley started, and stopped, because she'd been about to say we already have Homelander, and Homelander was standing right there, and the silence that filled the space where the sentence died told everyone in the room exactly how safe Homelander made them feel. Saturn heard it too. He let it ring. Yes, he said softly. You have him. You have a god you cannot control who could end every person at this table between heartbeats and grows a little more bored, a little more cruel, a little more lonely every month. That is not power. That is a fire in the house you have chosen to call a hearth. I am offering you a hand on the throttle. I am offering you the one thing he can never give you, which is the certainty that tomorrow will be like today. He spread his own hands. You spend fortunes on the illusion of control. I am offering you the real thing, at no cost but the truth, that you never had it, and I do. And here was the terrible mechanism of it, the thing that made Saturn what he was, and made the iron law bite. He wasn't threatening them. A threat they could fight. Threats galvanized, threats made enemies. Vought had a century of practice destroying anyone who threatened it. But Saturn wasn't offering them a fist. He was offering them relief. Relief from the exact fear they lived in every day. The fear of the unstable god at the top. The fear of the exposed secret. The fear of the machine running with no one at the wheel. He had found the thing every person at that table wanted more than money, more than status, more even than their little coins. He'd found the wish, buried under all the ambition, to be taken care of, to hand the terror to someone older and stronger, and let them carry it. It was the oldest hunger in the human animal, and Saturn had been feeding on it, world without end, for 8 centuries. Half the table wanted to say yes. Ashley could see it in Voss, who had not slept in a week, in 3 of the quieter owners who'd spent years pretending the Homelander problem was manageable, in the way the room's fear had, over the course of 4 minutes, curdled into something that felt disturbingly like longing. That was the horror. He hadn't cracked their defenses. He'd offered to end the siege, and part of them was so tired of the siege that they'd have opened the gate themselves. No, Homelander said. He hadn't moved from the window, but every head turned. He was smiling, the wide, bright camera smile, and his eyes were doing the thing they did before something died. Cute speech, he said. Really. Very. You've clearly done this before. But see, here's what you got wrong, old man. You keep talking about the fire in the house like it's a problem. But he pushed off the glass, sauntered toward the head of the table, and the executives leaned away from him without meaning to, a field of reeds bent by a passing weight. I'm not the problem, sweetheart. I'm the whole point. This is my company. These are my people. And you. He stopped a few feet from Saturn, chin up, the boy and the god straining at the leash. You're a house guest who's forgotten who owns the house. I have forgotten nothing, Saturn said. You are correct that you are the point. You are the fire. Fires are useful. I keep fires. He looked at Homelander with an expression that was almost tender and entirely without fear, and the tenderness was worse than any contempt could have been. But a fire does not own the house, child. A fire is kept by whoever is willing to feed it and unafraid to let it die. You have spent your life certain that your strength makes you the master here. It makes you the most valuable thing here. That is not the same. And the distance between those two facts is the distance between you and me, and it is the reason you came down to my room 3 nights running, to sit in the only silence in this world that did not lie to you. The room stopped breathing, because he'd said it out loud, in front of them. The thing about the night visits, the thing Homelander had told no one, the private hunger the god had thought was his secret alone, laid on the table like Kobluk's coin, a demonstration that Saturn owned Homelander's shame the way he owned everyone's. For one endless second, the red bloomed full in Homelander's eyes, and every soul at the table understood they might be about to watch the 41st floor become a crater. Ashley's hand found the underside of the table. Kobluk closed his eyes. And then Homelander laughed, too loud, too bright, the laugh of a man papering over an abyss. And the red guttered, and he turned it into a joke, because turning it into a joke was the only exit that didn't require admitting the thing was true. You're funny, he said, backing toward the door, pointing at Saturn like they were old pals sharing a bit. He's funny. Isn't he funny? No one laughed. We'll talk later, he said, the same line as the basement, the same retreat dressed as magnanimity, and then he was gone, and the boardroom sat in the wreckage of what had just been demonstrated, that the most powerful being on the planet had, twice now, walked away from the horned thing rather than test it, and that everyone had seen him do it. Saturn let the silence do his work. Then he looked around the table, at the frightened, tired, longing faces of the people who owned the world, and he said, gently, he will not save you. He cannot save himself. But I can save all of you, and I ask so little in return. He moved toward the door, unhurried, a landlord concluding a viewing. Take the week I have given you. Discuss it among yourselves. And when you are ready to stop being afraid, and you will be ready sooner than your pride expects, you will find that I am very easy to say yes to. He paused at the threshold and added, without turning, you already have. All of you. You simply have not admitted it yet. The door closed behind him, and in the bright cold room at the top of the world, 12 of the most powerful people alive sat in silence and discovered, each in the private dark behind their own eyes, that he was right. They tried to kill him on the 6th day. Not the board. The board was already lost, though they didn't know it yet, already softening toward yes in the way Saturn had promised. The kill order came from the one place in Vought that still ran on the old machine's reflexes, a black ops cell, 3 levels below legal, that existed to solve the problems no story could cover. They'd been watching the boardroom feed. They'd heard "Give me the company." And a handful of men whose entire professional lives were built on the premise that any problem could be ended with sufficient application of engineered violence had made a decision that the frightened owners upstairs were too compromised to make, and requisitioned everything Vought had ever built for killing things that couldn't be killed the normal way. That was the mistake. Not that they tried, that they thought Saturn hadn't been waiting for them to. Because Saturn understood something the Black Ops cell did not. That an offer of surrender is only believed once the alternative has been demonstrated. He had shown the board the hand. Now the fist needed showing, not to the board, who would have found it distasteful, but to the whole apparatus beneath them, the 1,000 functionaries and soldiers and handlers who did the machine's actual work, and who would only truly kneel once they had seen, with their own eyes, what happened to the parts of the machine that raised a hand against him. He needed a demonstration, and the Black Ops cell, in their certainty, had volunteered to be it. They came at him in the reinforced suite with the best Vought had. Anti-Soop rounds. The specialized ammunition tuned to punch through V-hardened tissue. A BCL red delivery system, the compound that could put down even Soldier Boy. Aerosolized and pumped through the vents. 2 temporary V-operatives juiced to the gills. Strength and speed dialed to the edge of what a human frame could hold. And, cued to move the instant the others engaged, a nullifier rig reverse-engineered from Soldier Boy's own power-canceling burst. The one weapon that had, in this world, actually worked on the unkillable. Every single thing they brought was built to kill a Soop. And Saturn was not a Soop. That was the whole architecture of the Iron Law, and it held now like a law of physics. The anti-Soop rounds were engineered to defeat V-hardened flesh. Saturn's flesh had never been within 1,000 miles of V. It had been made durable by 800 years, and a mythical zoon, by a biology this world had no framework for, and the specialized rounds struck him and did what ordinary rounds would have done, which was nothing at all. They flattened against him and fell, and he did not so much as look down. The BCL red flooded the room, the compound that dissolved V-based physiology from the inside, and it found nothing to dissolve. It was a poison keyed to a lock Saturn's body did not possess, and it hissed through the vents and pooled, and did precisely as much to him as fog. And the nullifier, the Soldier Boy burst, the one true counter, reached out to cancel the V-source of his power, and found no V-source to cancel, groped through him for a thing that wasn't there, and switched itself off against the great indifferent fact of a being whose strength this world had simply never accounted for. The temporary V-operatives were faster. They reached him, and Saturn transformed. There is a difference between a monster and a revelation, and the men in that room learned it in the last 2 seconds of their lives. It began with the horn. The pale curve that swept back from his brow was suddenly not ornament, but promise, and the robed figure came apart along seams that had always been there, and no one had thought to look for. He grew. Not the way Homelander loomed on a stage. This was volume arriving into the world, mass folding out of somewhere impossible. The ceiling of the reinforced suite meeting a skull that had decided the room was a suggestion. The ox head crowned it, vast and pale and ancient, eyes like 2 cold furnaces. Below, the body did not resolve into anything the human eye wanted to accept. Legs multiplying, articulating, a spider's terrible economy of limb bearing up a bulk that should not have been able to move and moved anyway. Fast, wrong, the Ushi-oni of a yokai-haunted sea, walking out of 800 years of myth and into a Vought sublevel that had thought itself the most frightening room in the world. The temporary V-operatives, men who seconds before had been the most dangerous humans on the planet, juiced to strength that could bend steel, met it, and were unmade, not fought, unmade, the way weather unmakes a tent. One was simply not present anymore. The other had time for a single sound before the vast pale shape moved through the space he occupied, and the space stopped being occupied. The walls Vought had reinforced overnight folded like the cardboard they'd been pretending not to be. And through it all, this was the part the surviving footage would linger on, the part that broke the men watching from the security hub upstairs. The thing made almost no noise. There was no roar. A creature this size, doing this, should have shaken the foundations with its fury. Instead, it moved with the awful quiet of something that felt no fury at all, that was not enraged, that was doing housekeeping. Because that was the truth of it, the truth Saturn wanted the whole machine to see. He was not angry. Anger was for creatures who might lose. The Ushi-oni walked through the best weapons Vought had ever built with the bored competence of a man wiping a counter, and every functionary watching the feed upstairs understood, in the deep place beneath thought where loyalty actually lives, that they had spent their careers serving power, and had never once, until this exact moment, seen what power actually was. Then it was over, and the robed man stood again in the wreckage, unmarked, and looked up at the security camera he knew was watching, and said, to the whole apparatus of Vought, at once, "That was necessary. It will not need to happen again." A pause, patient, almost gentle. "You sent your best to end me, and I have shown you your best. Now you know. Some of you are relieved. That is the correct response. It means you have understood that the frightening thing has become your frightening thing, and that is the safest a person in your position can be. Homelander watched the whole thing from the security hub. He had not intervened. He told himself, later, in the cold air above the tower, that it was strategy. Let the old man burn his political capital. Let Vought's own dogs tire him out. Keep his own hands clean and his own certainty untested. But that was a lie of the kind he was getting worse at telling himself, because he'd sat in that hub and watched the anti-Soop rounds do nothing, and the BCL Red do nothing, and the nullifier, the thing that worked on Soldier Boy, the thing that in the back of his mind he'd half planned to use on the old man himself someday, reach into Saturn and find nothing to hold. And he had understood, watching, that every weapon in this world that could theoretically be used against him had just been used against Saturn, and had failed, not because Saturn was tougher than Homelander, but because Saturn was outside the whole system those weapons were built for. There was no BCL Red for what Saturn was. There was no nullifier keyed to his frequency. Homelander, for all his terror, lived inside a set of rules. V-rules, the physics of this world's power. And those rules meant there was always, theoretically, a way to kill him. A syringe or a burst or a compound. A fact that had gnawed at the edge of his invulnerability his whole life. Saturn lived outside the rules, and watching the oxhead fold the reinforced walls, Homelander felt the last of a feeling he'd been fighting all week finally complete itself. The recognition that he had, at long last, met the one thing in creation that he could not be sure of killing, and that could, he made himself finish the thought, very possibly kill him. He did not go down to fight it. That was the moment, if there was a single one, when it turned, when the most powerful being on the planet stood in a security hub and chose, out of the truest fear he had ever felt, not to test the question. He told himself he was being smart. Somewhere beneath that, the boy on the table understood that he had just done the thing he most despised in others. He had knelt without kneeling. He had let the bigger predator eat, and been grateful it wasn't him. And beneath even that, this was the part he would circle in the dark for the rest of the story. A small, obscene, unbearable part of Homelander had watched Saturn walk through Vought's arsenal untouched, and felt not only fear, he had felt relief. Because for his entire life, Homelander had been the strongest, and being the strongest meant being alone at the top of a world that could still, with the right syringe, end him, carrying all of it, the fear and the loneliness, and the crushing weight of being the thing everyone else was afraid of, with no one above him to hand any of it to. And here, at last, was someone above him, someone older and stronger and outside the rules, who had looked at him with those ancient eyes and said, "You have never sat in a room with someone who was not afraid of you." The horror wasn't only that Saturn could destroy him. The horror was that some starving, unloved 8-year-old part of Homelander, watching the one being he couldn't be sure of beating stand unkillable in the wreckage, had felt, for one shameful instant, the thing he'd been chasing his whole life, in the love of a crowd that always curdled. He'd felt safe. He shut it down. He shut it down so hard the console in front of him cracked under his hand. He flew up into the dark and circled the tower and told himself, over and over, that he was Homelander, that this was his city, his company, his world, that no horned thing from a hole in the basement was going to take it. And every lap around the tower, the thing he couldn't shut down was the memory of that relief, and how much, God help him, he'd wanted it to be real. Down in the wreckage, Saturn dismissed the last of the security personnel with a look and stood alone among the folded walls. The demonstration was complete. The fist had been shown. Now the apparatus knew, top to bottom, board to black ops, that resistance had been tried by the best of them and had failed absolutely, and that the thing they should feel about this was not despair, but the deep, guilty, longed-for relief of a frightened people who have finally been conquered by something strong enough to make the fear stop. The board would say yes within the day. He'd known they would. He had only ever been demonstrating it to them. Saint Jaygarcia Saturn looked up, once, in the direction of the god circling the tower in the cold, and thought, with the patience of 800 years, with the certainty of a hand that had held 10,000 fires, "And you, child, you will say yes last of all, and mean it most." The board said yes without ever taking a vote. That was the genius of it. The thing that made Saturn's coup unlike any hostile takeover in Vought's blood-soaked history. There was no moment to point to. No document, no signature, no dramatic capitulation anyone could later claim they'd resisted. There was only a Tuesday that felt slightly different from the Monday before it, and then a Wednesday that took the Tuesday for granted. Kobluk found himself, in a meeting about a licensing dispute, asking aloud what our guest downstairs would prefer, and no one corrected the phrasing, and the phrasing became procedure, and by Thursday a junior VP was routing a decision to Saturn's suite, as though there had always been a box on the org chart for it. There hadn't been. There didn't need to be. Saturn had told them the truth in the boardroom. He did not want to be named on a document. Documents were the story. He wanted the thing under the story, and the thing under the story changed hands so quietly that the people handing it over experienced the transfer as their own good judgment. This was what Butcher and Huey, watching from the outside, could not get a grip on. They kept waiting for the takeover. They kept watching for the coup, the purge, the announcement, the blood in the lobby. Frenchie ran every feed he could reach and reported, baffled, that nothing was happening. Vought's stock was fine. Its programming was fine. Its executives badged in and out on schedule, smiled in their meetings, sent their normal emails. The most powerful corporation on the continent was, by every external measure, having an entirely ordinary month. That's not possible, Butcher said, for the third time, in the dead auto shop. You don't walk a company off a bloke like Edgar and have nothing happen. And yet, Frenchie said, pale in the laptop glow, nothing happens. That is what is happening. Nothing. Loudly. He turned a screen around. Except, look, the pattern of nothing. 6 executives who fought each other for a decade, suddenly agreeing. 3 lawsuits Vought would have crushed, quietly settled, generously, out of nowhere, no fight. A senator Vought owned, who was making noise about hearings, suddenly gone silent, and not the way they go silent when Vought buries them, the way they go silent when they've been reassured. Frenchie's cigarette had burned to the filter, forgotten. It is not chaos, Butcher. That is what frightens me. A takeover looks like chaos. This looks like order. Someone has walked into the loudest, most dysfunctional machine in the world, and it has, all at once, started running smoothly. That is not a company being conquered. That is a company being tuned. Huey felt something cold settle in his stomach. By someone who's done it before, he said quietly. For a really long time. That was the thing none of them could hold in their heads, because it was too large. They'd spent their whole lives fighting Vought as a monster of dysfunction. The greed, the panic, the cover-ups, the Homelander problem, the whole thrashing, dangerous mess of it. And the mess had been the thing that gave them room to operate. The boys survived in Vought's blind spots, in the gaps between its warring factions, in the chaos its own rot generated. A Vought that fought itself was a Vought you could slip a knife into. But a Vought that had stopped fighting itself. A Vought made calm, coherent, patient, running on 800 years of somebody else's practiced hand, was a thing with no blind spots at all. Saturn wasn't making Vought more dangerous by making it crueler. He was making it more dangerous by making it work. Stan Edgar felt the machine turn under him and understood, with a clinician's clarity, that he had waited one day too long. He'd been the one-man positioned to see it early, sidelined, ignored, watching from his diminished office with the eyes of the man who'd built the thing. And what he saw, over that quiet week, was his life's work being demonstrated back to him by a superior practitioner. Every technique Edgar had ever used to manage Vought, the reassurance, the invisible steering, the art of making people want what you needed them to want, Saturn used, but older, deeper. Without the human hesitations Edgar had never quite been able to burn out of himself. Edgar had ruled by making people believe he was inevitable. Saturn ruled by being inevitable, and the difference was 800 years wide. Edgar had reached out to Butcher because he'd calculated that the boys were the one force outside the machine that could still move against Saturn. That calculation had been correct. What he'd failed to calculate, the human error, the last one he'd allow himself, was that Saturn would find him first. The old elder came to Edgar's office himself. He did not send handlers. That was its own message. Saturn dealt personally only with the pieces he considered worth the courtesy. and Edgar understood the compliment and the threat braided inside it. "You are the one who built this," Saturn said, settling, the chair holding him this time, in the smaller room, and regarding Edgar with something close to professional respect. "I have been studying your work as I studied the rest. You are the only mind in this company that ever understood what it actually was. The others believe they own power. You knew you only tended it. That is rare. In 800 years, I have met perhaps 100 men who understood the distinction." He inclined his head, a master acknowledging a journeyman. "You would have ruled a small world well, Stan Edgar. You had the temperament. You lacked only the time and the durability to survive the men who feared your competence. They pushed you aside. They were fools too. I would not have." "You came here to gloat," Edgar said. His voice was steady. It cost him. "I came here to offer you the same thing I offered the others, because you have earned a genuine version of it, rather than the flattery I gave them." Saturn's ancient eyes held him. "Work for me. Not as a figurehead. I have 12 of those upstairs, and they bore me. As a hand. You know this machine better than anyone alive. I know how to own such machines better than anyone who has ever lived. Together we would be efficient. You would have back the thing they took from you. The pleasure of running it well. I ask only that you run it for me." A pause. "You reached out to Butcher. I know. I have known since the night you did. I have done nothing about it, because a man in a cage will always test the bars, and I do not punish men for being what they are. I am giving you a better door than the bars. Take it." And Edgar, cold, brilliant, ruthless Stan Edgar, who had never in his life let sentiment cost him a decision, sat with the offer, and felt the full weight of how good it was. Because it was good. It offered him everything he'd lost, and dressed the surrender in genuine respect, which was more than Vought had ever given him. A lesser man would have taken it. A younger man might have. "No," Edgar said. Saturn tilted his head, curious rather than displeased. "Why? You gain nothing by refusing. I win with you or without you. You are trading comfort for a principle, and I did not take you for a man who valued principles over outcomes." "I don't." Edgar removed his glasses, cleaned them. An old habit. A man buying himself the dignity of a beat. "I'm refusing, because you've made an error, and it's the same error every conqueror makes, and I'm going to enjoy the fact that 800 years didn't cure you of it." He replaced the glasses. "You think Vought is the machine. It isn't. Vought is a symptom. The machine is a country that wants to be lied to, that wants its gods prepackaged, and its horrors kept off screen, that will hand its throat to anyone who promises the show goes on. I didn't rule that country. I surfed it, same as you'll try to. And the thing about that country," he almost smiled, "is that it's ungovernable by anyone who actually wants to keep it. It eats the hand. It ate mine. It'll eat yours. Homelander is the only creature it's ever truly loved, and it loves him precisely because he's as unstable and hungry and stupid as it is. You're too good at this, Saturn. You'll run it beautifully, and it'll hate you for the competence, because competence was never what it wanted. It wanted a monster who looked like a hero. You're a monster who looks like a manager. That's the one thing it won't forgive." For a long moment Saturn said nothing. Then he rose, and there was in his ancient face something that might almost have been the pleasure of a good game well played by an opponent who would lose anyway. "That is the most intelligent thing anyone has said to me in 300 years, Saturn said. "You may even be right. I have ruled worlds that loved their chains and worlds that hated them, and the ones that hated them were more work." He moved to the door. "It changes nothing. But I will remember you said it, and when the country turns on me as you promise, I will think of you, and I will manage it, because managing it is the one thing I have never once failed to do." He paused at the threshold. "You've chosen Butcher over me. I understand. It is the human thing, to prefer the devil who shares your species. I won't stop you. I want you to understand that I am not going to have you killed, or contained, or silenced. I am going to let you go and help him, because it will make no difference, and because a world in which even a man like you cannot stop me is the most complete demonstration I could offer of what I am. Go, warn them, tell them everything." His voice did not rise. "It is already too late, and letting you prove it to yourselves is far more instructive than stopping you would be." The door closed, and Stan Edgar sat alone in his small office, having just been released to fight by the thing he was fighting, and understood that this, being allowed, being found, harmless enough to free, was the most frightening thing that had ever happened to him. That night, Homelander came down to Saturn's suite for the 4th time. He didn't announce why. He never did. He came in with the swagger stapled on and the eyes doing their bright dead thing, and he stood in the room where no one lied to him, and after a while, in a voice that tried to be a taunt and came out closer to a question, he said, "They're all saying yes to you. Even Edgar's running scared. Whole company's yours now, basically. So what happens to me in this little kingdom of yours, huh? Where do I fit?" Saturn looked at the most powerful being on the planet, at the wound with a cape on it, at the boy who had circled the tower every night since the demonstration, unable to fight and unable to leave, and answered with the terrible gentleness that was his most dangerous weapon. "You already know where you fit," Saturn said. "And you have known since the basement. You are the fire I keep. And you came down here tonight, as you came the other nights, because for the first time in your life, there is someone in the world it is safe to be small in front of, because I am the one being you cannot frighten and cannot fool, and so, alone among all the liars in your life, I am the only one you can ever stop performing for." He let it land. "You hate that. You will hate it for a long time, and you will keep coming down these stairs, because the hate is not as strong as the hunger, and I am, at last, someone strong enough to hold what you are without needing anything from it." Homelander stood very still. The red did not come. For once, in the quiet of that room, the most dangerous man alive did not have a single thing to say, and both of them understood that his silence was the last yes Saturn had been waiting for. "He wants to help us," Butcher said. "Edgar, Stan bleedin' Edgar, wants to sit down and help." He laughed the ugly laugh, but there was no bottom in it now. Week ago, I'd have paid money for that sentence. They were all in the auto shop, the whole crew, plus one. Edgar sat in the single chair under the single bulb, with the composure of a man who had decided that the absurdity of his position was beneath comment, and he'd laid it all out. The boardroom, the demonstration in the sublevel, the anti-Soop rounds and the BCL red, and the nullifier all failing, the quiet coup that left no fingerprints, and the thing he'd said to Saturn's face, and the thing Saturn had said back. "Warn them, it is already too late." Huey had listened to all of it with a rising nausea he couldn't name until Edgar got to the end. Then he named it. "He let you come here," Huey said. "He knows we're meeting. Right now. He knows and he doesn't care." "He knows," Edgar agreed. "He considers you harmless. He considers me harmless. That is the situation I am asking you to change." "And why would we?" Leaned against the workbench, arms folded, the exhaustion in him gone flinty. Man walks in here, the man who spent years trying to put every one of us in the ground, and asks us to save Vought. Save Vought. You hear yourself, Edgar? You want us to stop the one thing that ever actually scared your company, so your company can go back to being the thing that ruins the world at a slightly more comfortable pace. He shook his head. Nah. Let the horned bastard have it. Let him have all of it. Two monsters in a bag. Let him sort it out. Why is that our problem? And this was the dilemma, the real one, the one the whole story had been walking toward, laid bare on a workbench in a dead auto shop, and it split the crew clean down the middle. Because wasn't wrong. That was what made it agony. Everything the boys had ever suffered, they'd suffered fighting Vought. Robin, Becca, MM's father, dead of the stress of a lawsuit Vought had ground him under for decades. Kimiko's whole stolen childhood. Every scar the crew carried had Vaught's fingerprints on it, and here was a chance, a real one, to simply stand aside and let the corporation that had authored all of it be devoured by something bigger. Do nothing. Let the wolves eat the wolves. Wasn't that, in some rough cosmic ledger, justice? Because he's worse, Huey said, quietly, to the room. That's why. I know how it sounds. Believe me. I've spent my whole time here being the guy who says the annoying, careful thing. But listen. He stood, because he needed to. Because he'd learned that Butcher only heard you if you took up space. Everything we hate about Vought, the greed, the panic, the cover-ups, Homelander, all of it comes from the fact that Vought is broken. It's a mess. It's a bunch of scared, greedy people and one unstable god all crashing into each other. And yeah, it's a nightmare. But it's a nightmare that trips over its own feet. We've stayed alive for years because Vought is too busy fighting itself to finish us. The chaos is the crack we live in. He looked around at them. Edgar just told us Saturn's fixing it, making it calm, making it work. He's taking the most dangerous machine on Earth and he's tuning it. And he's got 800 years of practice running exactly this kind of machine. And when he's done, there won't be any cracks. No panic. No infighting. No blind spots. Just a smooth, quiet, perfectly run engine of control, owned by something that doesn't age, doesn't die, doesn't get bored and make mistakes like Homelander does, and can't be killed by anything in this world, because none of it was ever built for what he is. His voice cracked. We don't get to pick between Vought and Saturn. If Saturn wins, there's no later. There's no next fight. He's not a monster we can outlast, because he's already outlasted everything. He'll still be running the world in 1,000 years, and there won't be a single crack left to hide in. Vought, at its worst, is a house on fire. Saturn is the house nobody ever gets out of. The bulb hummed. Kimiko, who had been still through all of it, signed something slow and deliberate, and read it, and his jaw tightened. She says, translated, the men who took her, who made her a weapon. They were not the cruel ones. The cruel ones you can fight. They make mistakes. They lose control. They leave doors open. It was the calm ones she could never escape. The ones who were patient. The ones who never got angry. He was quiet a second. The ones who owned her without ever raising their voice. That landed harder than anything Huey had said, because Kimiko knew. Of all of them, Kimiko had lived inside the machine Huey was describing, and she was telling them that the calm hand is the one you never get out from under. Butcher had said nothing for a long time. He stood at the edge of the light, and Huey watched the war happen behind his eyes. The whole architecture of the man, built brick by brick out of hate, running the equation and hating the answer it kept returning. Say we do it, Butcher said finally, low. Say we help. You understand what that is, Huey? We spend our lives tearing at these bastards, and now, what? We ride in and save Vought, save Homelander even. 'Cause you can bet your arse the two of them are cozy by now. Everything I've done, everything I've lost. His voice was raw in a way the crew almost never heard. Becca died so I could hurt these people, and you want me to protect them. No, Hughie said gently. I want you to protect the world from the one thing that would make Vought permanent. He held Butcher's eyes. You've been trying to burn Vought down for years, right? Here's the thing you have to hear, Butcher, and I need you to actually hear it. A burning house can be put out. It can collapse. It can be rebuilt into something better. That's the whole hope, that someday the fire ends and something cleaner grows. But if Saturn finishes, the house never burns again, and it never falls, and it never changes. He saves it, forever, in the exact shape that's worst for everyone in it. If you let Saturn win to spite Vought, Huey's voice dropped. You don't destroy the thing you hate. You make it eternal. You hand it the one gift it could never buy, a hand steady enough to hold it up forever. Something broke in Butcher's face. Not softness. Butcher didn't do softness. But the recognition, at last, of a trap he'd almost walked into with his eyes open, that his hatred, the purest thing he had, could be used. That Saturn had counted on exactly the instinct had voiced, let the wolves eat the wolves, and that saying yes to that instinct meant becoming the instrument of the worst outcome imaginable. Saturn hadn't even needed to fight the boys. He'd nearly gotten them to step aside, to hate Vought so much they'd let him make it forever. Bastard, Butcher breathed, and there was something almost like awe in it. He's playing us in all. He let Edgar come here, 'cause he reckoned our hate do his work for him. He wanted us to sit on our hands. Yes, Edgar said from his chair. First word in a long while. Now you understand him. He does not defeat his enemies. He arranges for them to defeat themselves, and thank him for it. He has done it to my board. He is doing it to Homelander. He very nearly did it to you, in this room, tonight. And the only reason he failed is that this young man, a nod at Huey, dry, almost respectful, is smarter than your hatred. He stood, straightening his cuffs. I have no illusions about what you think of me. But I built that machine, and I would sooner see it burn on its own terms than run smoothly forever under something that will never let it die. On this one thing, gentlemen, the devil you know is asking to fight beside you. I'd take the offer. There won't be another. The crew looked at each other. At Hubie, who'd said the frightening true thing again. At Kimiko, who knew the calm hand from the inside. At whose let the wolves eat the wolves had been the exact door Saturn wanted them to walk through, and who now, slowly, uncrossed his arms. Damn it, said, to the floor. Damn it, he's right. The kid's right. He looked up. I hate that the kid's right. Butcher stared into the dark past the bulb for a long moment. When he turned back, the old cold light was in his eyes, but pointed, for the first time in the whole story, at something other than Vought. Right, Butcher said. So here's where we are. Somewhere up in that tower there's a horned bastard who's about to own the world forever. And the only thing standing between him and that is us. Stan Bloody Edgar and, God help me, I can't believe I'm saying it, Homelander, if we can peel him off the old man before he's too far gone. He cracked his knuckles. Never thought I'd see the day I had to save that flying prick to spite someone worse. But if there's one thing I know how to do, the grin came back, wolfish, terrible, alive in a way it hadn't been in months. It's fight dirty against something that reckons it's already won. So, Frenchie, tell me everything Vought ever built that we haven't tried yet, and somebody get me a way to talk to Homelander that doesn't end with me as a red smear. 'Cause we're about to do the stupidest thing this crew has ever done. A beat. We're gonna go start a war inside Vought Tower, and we're gonna do it on the same side as the two people I hate most in the world. The bulb hummed. Outside, the city slept beneath its bright manufactured gods, none of them dreaming that the men who'd spent their lives trying to tear that world down were, tonight, the only thing left trying to keep it from being locked in amber forever. Getting to Homelander was the part that should have killed them, and the reason it didn't was that Homelander was already looking for a reason. Butcher made contact the only way that had a prayer of working. He didn't sneak. He walked one of Frenchie's burner signals, straight into a Vought frequency Edgar still knew, and he sent 4 words up the tower, on an open channel he knew the god monitored in his sleepless circling. He owns you now. Then he waited on a rooftop 3 blocks from the tower, with his hands empty, and his heart going like a hammer, betting his life on a read of the one man he'd spent that life wanting dead. Homelander came down out of the dark and hung in the air over the rooftop, and for one long second, Butcher was certain he'd misjudged it, and this was how it ended. Opened throat to groin by the thing he hated most, on a roof, in the cold, with nothing accomplished. You've got stones, Homelander said. I'll give you that. What did you mean? He owns me. You know exactly what I meant, Butcher said, or you'd have burned me before I finished the word. He's got the board. He's got Edgar running scared. And he's got you coming down them basement stairs every night like a kicked dog, 'cause he's the one thing that ever made you feel. Butcher watched the red start to kindle and gambled everything on the next word. Safe. And you hate it. You hate that you love it. And somewhere in that big broken head of yours you already know that the day he doesn't need the fire anymore, he puts it out. 'Cause that's what he does. He keeps things till they're not useful, and then he's had 800 years of practice, ending 'em quiet. The red hung there, half lit, trembling on the edge. Butcher had just described, out loud, the exact shape of the thing Homelander had been circling the tower to avoid looking at. And the most dangerous being on the planet did the most dangerous thing he was capable of, which was listen. I don't need you, Homelander said, but he didn't leave. No, Butcher agreed. You don't need me. You need him gone, and you can't do it alone, 'cause you've stood in front of him twice now, and walked away both times, and we both know why. He's outside your rules. Nothing you've got touches him, but he's outside ours too. The anti-Soop kit, the red, all of it, useless. So it's not about the weapons. He took a step, hands still empty. It's about the one thing he's got that even 800 years didn't fix. He's arrogant. He reckons he's already won. He let Edgar walk out to warn us, 'cause he wanted to prove nothing could stop him. A man that's sure he can't lose. That's a man who stops watching the door. And I have spent my whole miserable life being the thing that comes through the door these bastards stopped watching. The grin, feral, offered like a blade held by the flat. You want him off your throne, sunshine? Then for one night, You and me are on the same side. And after, you and me can go right back to killing each other with my blessing. But tonight, we go take your house back, before it stops being yours forever." Homelander looked down at Billy Butcher for a long, long moment, at the one man on Earth who hated him without a shred of fear, who just offered him the truth nobody else would, wrapped in exactly the contempt that, perversely, Homelander could believe because it wasn't flattery. And the boy in the god, who had spent a lifetime unable to tell love from a leash, recognized in Butcher's honest hatred something none of Vought's honey had ever given him, someone who wanted something from him that wasn't his obedience. "One night," Homelander said, "they went up the tower like a knife going into a body that thought it was armored. Frenchie had spent the hours mapping the one thing Saturn's tuned, coherent, beautifully run Vought no longer had: chaos. The old Vought had been all cracks, factions, panic, blind spots. Saturn's Vought was smooth, and smoothness meant predictable, and predictable meant Frenchie could tell you to the minute where every guard would be, because a perfectly run machine runs the same way every time. The very efficiency Saturn had imposed became the map the boys used to move through it. Kimiko went up the service corps like a rumor. MM and Frenchie took the security hub, not to fight it, but to feed it a loop, so that the machine's own eyes told it everything was calm, while the boys walked through its heart. Edgar, from a terminal 3 floors down, did the thing only he could do, spoke to the apparatus in its own voice, issued orders in the cadence of a man it had obeyed for decades, and peeled a dozen critical systems away from Saturn's control in the 10-minute window, before anyone thought to question why the old ghost was giving instructions again. And Homelander went straight up the outside of the building to the top, where Saturn was, because that was always going to be the fight that mattered, and everyone knew it. Saturn was waiting. Of course he was waiting. He stood in the ruined boardroom where he'd made his offer, the city spread out beneath the glass, and he did not seem surprised, or afraid, or anything but faintly, patiently interested, as Homelander came through the window in a spray of glass, and the boy's war lit up in the floors below. "You've chosen your side," Saturn observed. "I confess I am mildly disappointed. Not surprised. The fire always resents the hand. But disappointed. I had thought you further along." "Yeah, well." Homelander's eyes blazed full. "Turns out I don't love being kept." He hit Saturn with everything. It was the fight the whole story had been withholding, and it was terrible, and it was fast, and for the first time Saturn moved. Not the bored housekeeping of the sub-level, but genuine engagement, because Homelander at full commitment was the single most destructive force this world had ever produced, and even 800 years respected that. Heat vision that had done nothing before now came laced with everything Homelander had, and the boardroom became a furnace, and Saturn transformed mid-strike, the ox head crowning, the spider legs unfolding, the Ushioni and the flying god crashing through the top of Vought Tower, in a collision that cracked the glass for 40 floors down and lit the night sky over the city that worshipped exactly this kind of spectacle and had no idea it was watching its own fate decided. And Homelander could not win it. That was the honest, brutal shape of the iron law holding to the end. Saturn was older, stronger, outside the rules, and one-on-one he was simply more. He took the worst the apex of this world could give, and he gave back something the apex of this world could not survive. And there came a moment, the whole tower shaking, the boardroom a ruin, Homelander down on one knee in the wreckage with the ox head vast above him, when the most powerful being on the planet understood, at last and completely, that he had met the thing that could end him, and that it was about to. Which was exactly where Butcher wanted him, because it was never going to be Homelander who won. Huey had said it in the auto shop and Butcher had built the whole night around it. It's not about the weapons, it's about the arrogance. Saturn, certain he could not lose, focused entirely on the god in front of him. The loud threat, the fire, the obvious danger, had done the one thing 800 years should have taught him never to do. He'd stopped watching the door. And through the door came the plan the boys had spent the whole assault actually building, while Homelander bled to buy the time. Not a weapon that could kill Saturn. There wasn't one. Edgar's 10-minute window, Frenchie's mapped machine, Kimiko's silent climb, all of it had been aimed at a single target, and it wasn't Saturn's body. It was the breach, the aperture array, Project Threshold, The door in sub-level 9 that had brought Saturn through, still standing, still powered. The one machine in this world capable of reaching the seam between places, and the one thing that could send a thing back through it. Edgar had known it was there. Reyes, decent, terrified Reyes, who'd listened to Saturn talk about owning worlds and gone home sick with what he'd let himself start to want, had been turned by Huey in a single conversation in a parking garage, because the one thing Saturn's contempt for small people never accounted for was that small people talk to each other. And Reyes had spent the assault down in sub-level 9, with Kimiko standing guard over him, spinning the rings back up to the impossible power draw that browned out the grid, opening the door. They couldn't kill Saturn, so they did the only thing that could work against a thing that couldn't be killed. They sent him home. Homelander, on his knee, dying, was not the sacrifice. He was the bait, and he knew it, and that was the last bitter joke of the night. That the most self-important being alive spent the climax as a lure, holding the Oxhead's whole attention on the top floor, while the breach screamed to full power 14 floors down. And when it hit full, when the seam tore open in the sub-level and the pull of it reached up through the tower like a tide reversing, Saturn felt it, felt the door he'd come through open at his back, and turned, and for the first time in 800 years, for one single instant, Saint Jaygarcia Saturn was surprised. Cunning, he said, not afraid. Even now, not afraid. The Oxhead regarded the wreckage, the bleeding god, the breach hauling at him, and there was something almost like approval in it. You could not defeat me, so you declined to try. You removed me from the board, rather than take me off it. The pull strengthened, the whole tower groaned. Saturn's vast form began, slowly, to slide toward the seam that wanted him back. I have ruled 10,000 years across worlds without number, and I am undone by a boy who understood that a lock you cannot pick can still be opened from the other side. His ancient eyes found Huey somehow across the ruin. Huey, who had said the frightening true thing one time too many, and inclined the great pale skull, a master conceding to a student he'd fatally underestimated. Remember that you did not win, you postponed. Doors opened both ways, and the seam took him, the vast form folding backward into the light, the voice thinning across an impossible distance. Am very, very patient. And then he was gone, hauled back through the door into the between places, and the breach collapsed in a detonation that took sub-level 9 and 4 floors above it, and every trace of Project Threshold with it, so that no one could ever open that door again. Silence fell on Vought Tower. Homelander knelt in the wreckage of the boardroom, bleeding, alive, staring at the space where the thing that had made him feel safe had been. And Billy Butcher stood across the ruined room from the being he hated most in the world, both of them wrecked, both of them breathing, the impossible one-night alliance hanging in the air between them like smoke. Well, Butcher said, spitting blood, the grin coming back even now. That's your house back, sunshine. Enjoy it. He was already backing toward the stairs, toward his crew, toward the door Homelander had promised not to stop him through tonight. See you tomorrow, eh? Back to normal. Homelander said nothing. He knelt in the ruin of his throne room, the most powerful being on the planet, alone again at the top of a world too small for him, and for the first time understood that the thing he'd feared most about Saturn winning had come true anyway, in reverse. He'd gotten his house back, and he'd never, for the rest of his life, feel safe in it again. The story Vought told was that a rogue experiment had breached containment and been neutralized by Homelander at great personal risk. It ran on every channel by morning. There was footage, Vought always had footage, or made it, of the tower's cracked upper floors, of Homelander bloodied and heroic against a threat described in the vaguest possible terms, an unstable dimensional anomaly, a catastrophic R&D failure, a monster with no name and no coherent shape, defeated by the god the country loved. The stock dipped and recovered by noon. The senators who'd gone quiet stayed quiet, then slowly, over the following weeks, began to make noise again, the old dysfunctional noise, because the calm hand that had silenced them was gone, and the machine was thrashing back into its natural, broken, ungovernable shape. Kobluk's coin account stayed secret. Voss went back to not sleeping. The board resumed fighting itself within the week, and the relief of that, the return of the mess, the panic, the blind spots, was a thing none of them would ever admit they felt, because to feel it was to admit how close they'd come to preferring the alternative. That was the truth the surface story buried, the way it buried everything. For a few days, the most powerful people in the world had wanted to be owned, had felt the longing to hand the terror to something stronger and let it carry them, and they had gotten their wish taken away, and pretended, immediately and forever, that they'd never wished it. The truth was a product. It always had been. Vought packaged the whole affair into a heroic anecdote and sold it back to a country that would rather have the comforting lie, and the country bought it, gratefully, the way it bought everything, and the machine ground on. Stan Edgar watched the coverage from his small office, which was still small, because saving the company had not unsidelined him, and he'd known it wouldn't. He'd fought beside the boys not to win back his throne, but because he'd meant what he said. He would sooner see the machine burn on its own terms than run forever under something that would never let it die. He'd gotten that. Vought was once again free to destroy itself and everyone near it at its own chaotic pace, and Edgar found that this counted, in his cold arithmetic, as a victory. He cleaned his glasses and filed the whole thing away and went back to waiting and watching, because that was what he was, and because a man who understood machines knew that the interesting thing about a door was never that it closed. It was that doors, as the horned thing had said on its way through, opened both ways. Homelander did not sleep at all now. He circled the tower every night, higher than before, and the city glittered beneath him with its love, and its love was ash in his mouth in a way it hadn't quite been before Saturn, because he'd tasted the other thing. For a few nights in a basement he'd sat in front of a being he couldn't frighten and couldn't fool, and stopped performing, and felt, for the first time since the table and the straps, held. And then he'd helped throw it back into the dark, because it would have owned him, and both things were true at once, and neither would resolve. And that was the wound Saturn had left, that no story could cover. He'd shown Homelander that the safety he'd chased his whole life existed, and that the price of it was being owned, and that Homelander would rather be alone and terrified and free at the top of the world than safe and small under someone else's hand. He'd chosen, he'd choose it again, and he'd circle the tower every night for the rest of his life knowing exactly what he'd thrown away, and that no crowd, no matter how loud it screamed his name, would ever give it back. The boys scattered back into the cracks of the city, into the safe houses and the dead auto shops, into the blind spots that existed again because the machine was broken again. They'd won. They knew better than to call it that. They'd stood at the edge of a world locked in amber forever, and stepped back from it, and the reward for saving everything was that everything went back to being exactly as bad as it had been, which was the only reward the boys had ever gotten, and the only one they'd learned to expect. "We saved Vought," said, in the auto shop, staring at nothing. "We saved Homelander. God help us. That's the sentence. That's the thing we did." "We saved the chance," Huey said quietly. He was learning, slowly, to sit inside the ugly shape of their victories without needing them to be clean, because none of them ever were. That's all we ever get. Not a win, a chance to keep fighting. Saturn would have taken even that. He'd have made it perfect and permanent, and there'd have been nothing left to fight for. He looked at Butcher. A burning house can still be put out. That was the whole point. We kept the house burning so someday somebody can put it out. That's the job, isn't it? That was always the job. Butcher didn't answer right away. He was looking out the grimy window at the tower in the distance, its cracked crown lit up against the bruise-colored sky, the gods circling it in the dark. Something in him had shifted over that impossible night, not softened. Butcher never softened, but widened. Some part of him that had reduced the whole world to a single hatred forced, for one night, to hold two things at once. That he could want a thing dead, and still, when something worse came, stand between it and the door. He'd learned he wasn't only his hate, he'd hated learning it. "Yeah," Butcher said at last, quiet for him. "That's the job." Then the grin, tired but real. The old wolf finding his feet. "Right up until I get to do the other job, which is put Homelander in the fur, ground myself." "Postponed," the old bastard said. "Well, same goes, sunshine." He turned from the window. "Same goes for all of it. Put the kettle on, Frenchie. We're not done. We're never done. That's the whole bloody point." And somewhere beyond the seam of the world, in the between places where a door had closed, something very old and very patient waited, and did not rage, and did not despair, because rage and despair were for creatures who might lose, and Saint Jaygarcia Saturn had never, in 10,000 years across worlds without number, done anything but win eventually. Doors open both ways. He could be very, very patient. In the end, they didn't defeat him. You can't defeat a thing that's outlasted everything. You can only send it back and burn the door behind it, and hope the door stays burned longer than a patient God stays interested. The boys saved a world by preserving the very rot they'd sworn to destroy, because the only thing worse than a broken machine is a perfect one, owned by something that will never let it die. Homelander got his throne back and lost the only peace he'd ever tasted. Edgar got his chaos back and called it winning. And the country got its comforting lie, packaged and sold and swallowed whole, never knowing how close it had come to a silence from which it would never have woken. That's the ugly shape of every victory in this world, not a triumph, just a postponement. A house kept burning so that someone, someday, might finally put it out. The boys will take that. It's all they've ever been given. But 14 floors of Vought Tower stayed dark for a long time, where a door had been. And on the quiet nights, when the gods circled overhead and the city dreamed of its bright manufactured heroes, if you listened at the seam of the world, you could almost hear something patient on the other side, waiting for the next fool to build a door and call it progress. Saturn is gone. Saturn is patient. And doors, as he said, open both ways.